Welcome back and thank you for staying with us. Now, activists are once again raising concern at government's failure to provide basic infrastructure in rural schools. Amnesty International South Africa is urging the department to provide an update on the eradication of plain pit toilets in public schools. The organization says illegal pit toilets not only violate the right to sanitation, but also poses a serious risk to life. Let's discuss this further now. We're joined by Amnesty International South Africa's activism coordinator, Alicia Jooste. Alicia, thank you so much for your time here on eNCA. I already know what the department is going to tell you, that they inherited the system from the apartheid government, and it's not going to happen overnight that they are able to fix this infrastructure. For me, I always ask them how long we're expected to accept this excuse, but what would you say to them?
Firstly, thanks so much for having us on today. Look, I think that is something to take into consideration, and we do have to recognize that significant progress has been made since the end of apartheid, which did create, that legacy of segregation. But as you say, how long, the timelines that we're talking about for the eradication of pit toilets are their self-imposed timelines. So they've come up with these commitments, what they think is realistic, but they keep on missing their own timeline. So I think that's all we're holding them to account on. And as you said, this isn't just about the eradication of pit toilets, but there's serious consequences behind that. As you've mentioned, it threatens many rights, and it also threatens, the learning outcomes that students have. We know that when students are learning amongst poor infrastructure, we see irregular attendance and high dropout rates. So there are consequences, when it comes to missing these deadlines.
How does it look in terms of rural schools? If Amnesty International has been able to research, how do the numbers look at the moment in terms of schools that still have pit toilets?
So we conducted research and launched our reports in 2020. And those findings, we saw that over 5,000 schools still had pit toilets. From recent reports from the government, they said that it's now down to over 2,000 schools. But what we're also noticing is that the data provided can largely be inconsistent. We're seeing different stats and figures under different programs. And so it does become hard to keep track of overall progress made. We're not seeing the release of crucial reports like the 2022 National Education Infrastructure Management System reports that breaks down per province how many schools are still using plain pit toilets. And so we were hoping for an update, now that at the end of the financial year has passed, when they had said that the eradication of pit toilets would happen by. That hasn't happened, and so we're all urgently requesting that they do so.
Another thing that the Basic Education Department might say to you and I, if we ask them about pit toilets and the eradication of them at schools, is that, we saw all the flooding that happened in July or rather in April of last year, particularly in KZN. There's been more flooding in 7 out of the 9 provinces in our country during this period. They will also tell you about the July unrest back in 2021 that also set them back a little bit. And they'll say that the budget had to now be redirected to fixing that infrastructure and it added to their infrastructure backlog. It sounds like a good enough excuse to me, or a good enough reason to me. Does it to you?
Look, the Department of Basic Education has a track record of missing key deadlines. And as I said, these have all been self-imposed deadlines. This tracks us back to when we're talking about pit toilets to 2020, so before the flooding that we've recently witnessed. The key legally binding deadline in 2020, which came from the minimum norms and standards, we missed that. And so, I think that's what we've got to look at, that there's a cycle of missing these key deadlines. There will always be 1,000 excuses as to why something's not happening, but I think that's why it's always really important to take a step back why we need to see the eradication of pit toilets, how it threatens access to quality education, to health, to dignity. And that needs to be the priority, to ensure that every learner has a bright future, has access to education in this country.
So maybe what do you think is going on here with them missing their own deadlines? Because we're not the one who impose it on them. They tell us when they're going to do something and then they don't do it. So what do you think is the issue here? No political will, non-prioritization of key issues?
Look, I think there is, in some regard, an evasion of accountability of some kind. And there could be, as you've listed, many reasons behind that. But I think what we are seeing, a worrying trend, is that the government actually proposing, or the department proposing, to get rid of some of those, deadlines that actually allow us to help hold them to account. So last year we saw them proposing new amendments to the minimum norms and standards for school public infrastructure, which basically meant that they would remove all reference to deadlines. So I think there is a tendency for the government not to evade that accountability. And alongside partners, we have been calling on them to ensure that they keep to commitments, as I said, to bring it back to that core reason of why education is so important for people in South Africa, for young people in South Africa.
Amnesty International is saying 2,983 schools are still using pit toilets now. We already know that at these particular schools, there's also a problem of overcrowding. So if you say 2,900 schools, it's, I'm assuming, hundreds of young people's lives that are put in danger.
Exactly. And that's why there needs to be this urgency that we're just not seeing. At the end of the day, the government or the state has an obligation to ensure that every learner has access to sanitation. And to achieve that, safe sanitation, and to achieve that, we need to see deliberate, concrete and targeted steps to achieve this, to ensure that every child has access to quality education. The time for excuses is over. We just need action, and we need communication, transparent communication from the department of why they haven't communicated to us yet about missing this deadline. What were the reasons behind that? There's a really strong civil society movement in this country who wants to ensure this, who wants to, play their part, play their role in ensuring that kids have access to quality education. So it is about communication, accountability, and we're just not seeing that at this stage.
Well, Alicia, I can tell you one thing. We also have a problem of load shedding and, schools needing to procure, for instance, alternative power as well. And the fact that they will be able to do that at a much faster pace compared to when we used to have red tape. So I don't know if these 2,983 schools will be prioritized just yet. But thank you so much for speaking to us here on eNCA. South Africa has many problems, and then we have to put other problems aside continuously. That was Amnesty International South Africa's activism coordinator, Alicia Jooste.